Hello, it's Gill here. The subject of my presentation is that a good translation should be like a pane of glass, that you only notice it's there when there are imperfections in it. There are variations of this quote that come up frequently in essays and articles about translation, but first of all let's look at its origins to put it into context. The author of this quote is in fact Norman R. Shapiro, Professor of Romance Languages and Literature at Wesleyan University in the States. He is also writer-in-residence at Adams House at Harvard. He is well known for many translations from French into English, but in particular for his volumes of translations of Jean de La Fontaine's renowned fables. His pane of glass quote is found in his 1985 introduction to 50 Fables of La Fontaine. Word for word, this is what he says. Shapiro explains that the motivation behind his task of translating these fables is recreation as well as recreation. He talks about why and how he translates. The why, he says, is easy. He enjoys it and he likes the author. The how needs more analysis. He sees two basic elements, the meaning and the manner, or, as the late Seamus Heaney puts it, the tune and the tone. Shapiro feels that the tune can be found relatively easily, but the tone is more elusive, and here we move towards the idea of the pane of glass. Shapiro is talking about his translations of La Fontaine's fables, which were originally written in the second half of the 17th century. He is talking about a very specific type of literary poem, or poetic literature, where his declared aim is somehow to render the tone. He says, this flexible form, with its profusion of run-on lines, internal rhyming, and natural speech rhythms, afforded La Fontaine the perfect compromise between the poet's innate need for verse and the storyteller's need for the naturalness of prose. The resulting tension between freedom and constraint is one of the greatest charms of his work. It is this style of French literature that he is aiming to translate as invisibly as possible. Surely then we can agree that it should be a pane of glass. But delving a little deeper, what do we mean by an invisible translation? Invisibility is the term Venuti uses to describe the translator's situation and activity in contemporary Anglo-American culture. This was Venuti speaking in 2008. He says a translated text is judged acceptable when it reads fluently, when the absence of any linguistic or stylistic peculiarities makes it seem transparent, giving the appearance that it reflects the foreign writer's personality or intention, or the essential meaning of the foreign text. The appearance, in other words, that the translation is not in fact a translation, but the original. You would think from this that, as with Shapiro, this is an admirable thing. However, this is not Venuti's view. He bemoans the fact that reviewers frequently judge a translation by its fluency alone. Words like crisp, elegant, flows, and gracefully, and on the negative side, wooden, stilted, doughy, and new words like translatese, translationese, and translatorese are used in abundance by reviewers. Venuti remarks how a translator is frequently not mentioned in headnotes or reviews, and how reviewers fail even to mention that the book is actually a translation. He talks about the status of the copyright of the translated work, where, again, there is little credit or remuneration for the translator. The ambiguity of copyright law, that the translation must be an original piece of work, but that the rights assigned to it are negligible. He refers to the trade imbalance in publishing, which has serious cultural ramifications. Publishers sell translation rights for many English-language books, but rarely buy the rights to publish English-language translations of foreign books. Venuti believes that this successfully imposes Anglo-American cultural values on a vast foreign readership, while producing cultures in the UK and the USA that are aggressively monolingual, unreceptive to the foreign, Accustomed to fluent translations that invisibly inscribe foreign texts with English language values and provide readers with the narcissistic experience of recognising their own culture in another culture. All this he sees as a bad thing. With this strong political viewpoint, Venuti states, "The motive of this book, that is, the translator's invisibility, is to make the translator more visible so as to resist and change the conditions under which translation is theorised and practised today, especially in English-speaking countries." Again, this is Venuti in 2008. He also brings in Schleiermacher's two-option approach: move the reader towards the writer, or the writer towards the reader. Schleiermacher favoured the foreignising approach, one that deviates from native norms to create an alien reading experience. Venuti stresses that foreignising translation into English can be a form of resistance against ethnocentrism and racism, against cultural narcissism and imperialism, in the interests of democratic geopolitical relations. We can also look at translations of other types of text and how they should be rendered. There are, for example, discussions about Rupert Graves's translations of Suetonius's The 12 Caesars and the target culture expectations of how the translation should read. Should it be readable? With the decline in the study of the classics, is it justifiable to make this text accessible? His translation was so effective in responding to the target culture of the late 1950s that it actually became a bestseller. This brings us back to the question we keep seeing on this course: who is the target reader? What are we trying to achieve with a translation? We also have to remember that times change, and in this example 22 years separate his initial translation and a revised version in which he followed more accurately the foreign text. Finally, let's compare the pane of glass analogy between literary and non-literary translations. While translators of literature have choices across all the ranges of word for word, sense for sense, faithful, free, formal dynamic, semantic communicative, as well as domesticated foreignized and orientation towards the target reader or the source text, this is not true when it comes to technical materials. For example, multinationals need fluent, immediately intelligible translations of international treaties, legal contracts, technical information, and instruction manuals. The literary translator can experiment, the technical one can't. So, in conclusion, how far should we agree with Shapiro's pane of glass statement? For his admirable work on La Fontaine, I agree. You want to read unobtrusively through the poems. For technical translations too, I agree. But let's also give Venuti his due and say that, from an ethical point of view, the translator does need more exposure and recognition, and perhaps the way to achieve this is by making certain types of translations appear to be translations. From a geopolitical view, we can sometimes take a stand against domestication and help cancel out the historical emphasis that was born of imperialism and xenophobia. And, to close and to complete the metaphor of the pane of glass, let's not forget that, as Paul Valéry once observed, a poem is never finished, it can only be abandoned in despair. So while the poet, or translator, might say that the finished work is as polished and clear as it can be for the moment, when the sun shines through the pane of glass from another angle, the imperfections become visible and another polishing has to take place. And here in the last two slides is the bibliography. And thank you very much for your time, and I'm here to answer any questions.